The Darkside Detective is what I would call a classic point and click game in a bite-sized quantity, and that is because this is an episodic point and click game with fairly short episodes. As to why I decided to play this game, well, I must admit this is another case of Stadia Pro games that I'm milking until it runs out. But in my defense, games are expensive, so life. Anyways, enough rambling, let's actually start with the review with the story. Darkside Detective revolves around this section of the police focused on resolving these supernatural cases, things like ghost hauntings, zombie epidemics, that type of thing, but it's all through the veil of comedy, as this section of the police is not taken seriously, despite how seemingly normal and real these problems are in the world of the game, but also maybe where the comedy comes from, that these supernatural problems are so normal that they given less importance at the police station. And speaking of these officers, our main characters are very much the epitome of the characters in what are now classics of the point and click genre, with our main playable character, Detective Francis McQueen, a character that takes himself somewhat seriously despite the situations of the game, while also still being somewhat self-aware of his situation, and that working in a nice comical effect with his sidekick, Dooley, who is very willfully ignorant and I would say an almost childlike behavior, which is funny from a police officer, I guess. It's a very Sam and Max type of chemistry, just less chaotic, and personally I really enjoyed it. They are likable and there is a lot of lowbrow humor, but it's never too much, as there is a level of self-awareness in our main character. And working with that, during the mysteries there is always a level of subversion of the genre, as it turns the occult and other things in this genre usually used for horror tropes to a more comical side, and just having them be this kind of goofballs and laughing stock of the force also makes them underdogs in a way that you can root for when solving these mysteries. And overall, like I said, I really enjoyed it, and I think you would enjoy it as well if you already enjoy that classics LucasArts type of humor from when they were around doing point and click games. Final thing to finish this bit off though, addressing the episodic nature of the game, well, each episode it's its own separate story from each other, and it works here as you can really just pick up and play at any time. It feels there is no rush to beat it or play through the whole thing. It's a game that feels like watching your comfort food show, where you can just watch an episode and have a good time regardless of the situation. Yeah, overall it's good, let's move on. Gameplay now, it's point and click, as I already mentioned quite a few times, and it works very much like any other point and click game, where here in the 2D perspective you can interact with environments and collect items and combine them to solve puzzles. It is exactly like those old point and click games to a fault. As many people know, one of the biggest problems with that genre, especially during the 90s, was the so-called moon logic, where puzzles became very hard because they followed a string of logic that regular persons wouldn't really arrive to, and that's a problem because it breaks the flow of the game and it can outright stop you from progressing until you manage to solve it. And even when you do, it's not something that you feel good or like you have achieved something, as the thought process you have to do to find that solution felt illogical, and that just isn't very satisfying. And the thing is, in this game at first, it isn't like that. The first few levels are okay, they seem normal, but then the final few episodes start to suffer from this, and the bonus episodes do indulge in it a bit too much. But to be fair, those are the bonus episodes. Like I said, most of the game does not suffer from this, and for the most part it is okay. as a point and click game in the gameplay department, but it is of course propped up by the situations taking advantage of the whole occult stuff and of course its comical twist. There is also small puzzles, but these are far and far between, so I don't think I can even talk much about it without spoiling, and I don't think they add much that I think it's worth really going in depth about. They're just little games like moving pipes around so that water can pass through, or changing all the buttons in a grid to green, but once you click a button it also changes the adjacent ones. This might sound a bit confusing, but trust me, if you see the puzzle you know what I'm talking about, and they don't really have any twist to them, which I think would have been a nice thing as they are kinda generic. But also, again, they do not show up very often, so it's not a huge deal I guess. In terms of how much game there is though, well, we have 6 episodes plus 3 bonus ones, and episodes can really take anywhere between 5 to 30 minutes. And of course a big part of it is, well, are you going to get stuck at any point, and that of course would add to a lot of playtime. But I would also say the whole game including bonus missions would be around 3 to 4 hours, maybe more if you're just not very good at this type of game, but also I would say in that case you might not enjoy it if you just end up being stuck all the time. So to finish this bit off, the gameplay is okay, but it really becomes enjoyable because of how it's written, which is how a good traditional point and click should probably work, I think. Now moving on to the graphics. It's a pixelated art style, once again very reminiscent of the LucasArts era, but here in a flat 2D perspective, which ends up making everything feel a lot bigger than it would in those old games, but it works here as it is detailed enough and maybe even above that, stylized enough that even though I'm looking at characters with no face, I can still believe and be engaged in its characters in what would otherwise be a very uncanny looking game. So it looks good if you enjoy the pixel art and if that's your thing, which I know a lot of younger gamers might not be used to, but get used to it. Now in a more technical sense, by the fact I play this on Switch, I was well surprised, as my last experience with the pixel art game on Stadia was not great. It seems that the compression method just didn't like that art style. But here honestly I had no major issues with it, and in fact this might actually be one of the cleanest experiences yet with Stadia, which was just very surprising as someone who has gotten way too familiar with the yellow blobs. Maybe it's because the pixel art in this game, the pixels are a lot bigger, at least that's my theory, but who knows. I'm just glad that it didn't ruin my experience. Now final thing to talk about is soundtrack, which is good. For the most part it's very slow and subtle. It works with the ambiance of the supernatural and the haunting feeling that the areas give, well, at least before they take on a more goofy perception, and when that inevitably happens the music does change to accommodate that, which is a cool little thing. And of course it's also very period accurate, I would say, to the type of games. This one is very influenced by, once again, that old time point and click genre, and so I enjoyed it and I think it's pretty good. And that's my thought on this game. It's pretty good if you like point and click adventure games, and even above that you want that experience in a more digestible way with its episodic nature, and for those reasons I am giving Darkside Detective a 7 out of 10, a very positive score. It was close to an 8, but it just didn't quite make it due to the somewhat bland gameplay. Recommendations wise though, I absolutely recommend it if you're looking for a classic point and click game that is actually good and has pretty fun writing. If you have access to it like me on Stadia, then you have no reason not to try it, and if you plan on buying it, then $10 it's usually what it goes for, and it's a fair enough price. Now there is a sequel, but I can't recommend that of course because I have not played it yet and I cannot attest to its quality, but I personally very much want to try it out and review it at some point, and hopefully recommend it as well. Regardless of your decision though, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing and liking, and even commenting, all things that you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye.